Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv, here with a conversation episode. Oh, I'm so excited about this one. I just recently listened back to it to do this editing, and I love when listening back is like just as much fun as when I recorded it, and that is so the case for this one. So I spoke with Dr. Joe Watson, who I learned about from himself when he reached out to me last year. I was covering the stories of Iphis and Ianthe and of Caeneus/Caeneus. These are the two trans characters that are featured in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and he shared an article that he'd written about exactly this. It was so wonderful, and a conversation was like it was too late in the month to have a conversation for last year. So we kind of put it on the books for this year, and I'm so glad it worked out. We talked about Iphis as a trans character, or how they can be read as, you know, a kind of lesbian story that kind of gets its means of being like a real love story in ancient Greece, you know, all of these different ways that we can read these characters, and generally how we can understand them to be all these different forms of evidence of, you know, gender diversity and sexual orientation diversity in the ancient world. So we talked about the real intricacies of what makes Iphis very different from Caeneus, even as they are both trans characters. Absolutely fascinating. There's a bunch of asides into other amazing characters from Ovid's Metamorphoses, because that is what Joe specializes in. And so we talked a little bit about Atalanta and a little bit about Medusa and Arachne too, and just generally such a fun and informative and insightful conversation, and just perfect for Pride Month. I am recording this introduction weeks in advance, so I'm trying to put myself in when it'll actually be June, which it is not currently. But in any case, it's absolutely perfect for Pride Month, for once more featuring stories of LGBTQIA characters in the ancient world, which I really love doing every year, even if it is getting more and more difficult to find ways of telling stories because I've exhausted all of them. But thankfully, we have conversation episodes for that. And so this is just one of 3 new conversations that I've got coming this month. Now that I think about it, I don't know if this one's coming first, because it's just the first one I'm recording. We'll see. I'm going to stop trying to over-explain something and just let you get to the episode. Conversations, putting the trans in transformations. Iphis and Caeneus with Dr. Joe Watson. So, I mean, you'll have to forgive me because we originally talked about this like a full year ago.
Yep.
But I'm just like, I guess I'm fascinated by anything that you have to say in this realm, but like basically you've studied the 2 notable trans characters in the Metamorphoses, right? So it would be like Iphis of Iphis and Ianthe, and then Caeneus. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, what in what way if you study these characters, like what work have you done on them?
Sure. So I guess this like all originally came out of when I was doing my PhD. And I was interested in how there was this group of, we're going to complicate this term in a second, but let's start off with this group of female characters in the Metamorphoses who all sort of behave in the same way. And they all kind of like, and you'll be familiar from your reading through them. It's the ones, like the women who do these long speeches. So it's your Atalanta, Iphis, Mira. And they all kind of have the same sort of dynamics. I was interested in comparing those to each other. And then I had like Iphis in the middle of this. And I was like, but woman doesn't feel right to describe Iphis, alongside all these other ones who were just unambiguously definitely women. And so basically it started off as, I need to fill in a footnote in this dissertation to explain why Iphis isn't a woman, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to talk about this group of people, and Iphis is going to be in that group of people. And then from there, it kind of turned into, okay, I guess I'll write this, and then eventually we had a 10,000 word paper on our hands, and I was like, I need to send this off and publish this somewhere. And I kind of had a lot of, I guess, weird feelings about this as a non-trans person, but a queer person. I was like, so I was kind of going, should I publish this? Should I not publish this? Is this my story to tell? And then I thought, well, I know a lot about Ovid. I may not myself be trans, but I know a huge amount about Ovid. I love the Met. Maybe I can try and tell this story. So I guess that's where it came from originally. And then it just came across, I guess the next step was I got really annoyed at reading other people's writing about Iphis, particularly. And so I started going through all these articles, and you see the most weird, outdated language from classicists in like 2006.
Oh, God.
We are not talking about like 1960 here or anything.
Yeah.
Just stuff that I'm like, that's not even a slur. That just doesn't make sense.
Oh, God.
So, like, I can't remember who it is now. There's someone. Actually, I also wouldn't name and shame on the show. But there's
sometimes they deserve it, but I understand.
Sometimes they do. Who talks about like people being bisexual, and they don't mean like attracted to more than one gender. They just mean like with duplex sexual anatomy. So like in some way maybe intersex. And I'm just like, that's not even a helpful description. Like no one reading that would know what you mean.
No, that literally means something else. Like to everyone who reads the word.
And let's be honest, who's going to be reading the words about Iphis and the Anthony? Like, there's going to be a fair number of bisexuals in that audience going, what? That's what? Exactly.
Yeah.
So it was rage, basically, then propelled me on from there.
Fair.
Yeah, and in seeing all these weird things that other people had said, I realised there were so many things that seemed abundantly obvious, not just to me, but to so many people that I knew and that I could see on the internet. I was never like a Tumblr girly myself, but I was very aware of Iphis and Caeneus as being like characters in that kind of realm of the internet.
I bet they would be. Yeah, I was also never on Tumblr really, but I can see that. So real.
So I thought, this is not my hot take. This is very much something that's in the atmosphere. So I thought, if I just say some really obvious things, at least then someone said them, and they're in a publication record somewhere as having been said, so someone else can go, the argument has been made that Iphis is actually a trans character. I thought, great, if that could be done, that'd be wonderful. So I guess that's where it started.
Yeah, no, I really like that and identify with it, because like I mean, I still remember like years and years ago on the show originally reading that myth, and I know the first time I read through it and the first time I featured it on the show, I definitely remember coming out at the end and being like, I think you can see this character in two different ways depending on how you personally want to see them. Like, I think that Iphis can be read as a lesbian who was gifted some way of being with the person that they love in a society where they couldn't, or as this trans character. And the trans character works so well too. I mean, purely because like it's not just one trans character in the Met. And that is so interesting. And so, yeah, like I mean, one, just the fact that the Met has these characters is so important today, and also just like generally interesting. So I'm glad to know that people are writing about it. Like I don't have the same access to like the academic side, so I'm thrilled because you sent me your paper and that was so helpful. And I just remember like, oh, this is great, because like I'm not in that world. I don't even know where to go. Like, I mean, I know where to go looking, but oh my god, trying to weed through JSTOR as a person who's not in that realm anymore, like sometimes I just get lost every time. But yeah, so I was thrilled to have that. But it's such an interesting kind of concept to go through. I mean, I can't get over the bisexual thing though. And also like 2006, like I wish that surprised me, but like I graduated high school in 2006. It was not that long ago, even though, okay, fine, it was. But like, yeah, it's so wild the way that things have changed like so much, and also like not at all, but that's interesting. Yeah.
In another world that we fully don't need to go into, I do a lot of like late 19th century, early 20th century stuff, and describing someone who we would now call intersex as bisexuals just read to me like, this came out 1897. That's what this feels like. Yeah. It's like, no, this was in the mid 2000s.
Like, wow. I mean, I would expect, I would horribly expect a lot of transphobia in that time, because like, I grew up with Friends, the show, to be clear, but like, it's. But yeah, but to see that's just like nonsensical. Like, now I'm just like, I want to understand. Like, did it? I mean, No, I don't. Because I was gonna be
I
like, well,
think,
because I guess Iphis would like boys and girls, presumably, but like there is actually no acknowledgement that they would like
yeah, I
men.
mean, it's Ianthe all the way, and like
Yeah,
good for
exactly.
Iphis, like
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
one person direction, but yeah, no, I think I did look into it at the time, and it is a thing. It's just not a thing that normal people would say if they want to be understood.
yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, because I mean, like the word, the origins of the word itself make it make sense, but like the word itself does not mean that. So Here we are. Yeah.
So yeah, and then I think one of the things, because I didn't feel when I was writing this article like I was reinventing the wheel. I felt a bit like I'm saying things that people have been saying for years, but I'm saying them in a recorded way.
Yeah.
And some of the things I'm just like, well, there's so much interesting, obvious stuff. Like, even if Ovid doesn't know what a trans person is, and sure, maybe Ovid doesn't, he goes out of his way to say, Iphis is a name you can give to anyone of any gender. You go, he doesn't have to do that. And yeah, sure, it works in the nice, clever bit in the myth where you go, yeah, sure, this is a character who's potentially going to change gender. But also, he doesn't have to go out of his way to like allow that reading quite as well as he does. And he does allow that reading. Because I really liked what you said about you can sort of read this as anything depending on who you are, what you want to come at it from. And a couple of years ago, before I ended up publishing this piece, I did this workshop at the university I was at the time with undergraduate students where we looked at this story and we looked at the reception of this story in kind of modern literature, and we said, like, but what is this? Like, what label do we want to attach? And the number of different labels I got back from the audience saying, well, it was obviously this is what Iphis is. Obvious this is what Iphis is. And you go, well, none of you said the same thing. So it's clearly not that obvious. And that's a really nice thing about that story. And I think that's somewhere where my understanding like changed over time. I started off with this kind of rage, like, I need to make the political statement that Iphis is a trans man because no one else in the scholarship at least is making this political statement, and so it's really important. And then kind of going, yeah, it is. It's also quite important for lesbians as well, because it's not like there's a great number of lesbians out in classical literature for people to look at, and this is a nice, happy story. So I think it took some time, I think, to maybe calm down from my rage to go, actually, loads of people can read this, and that's good, actually.
Well, and I mean, I think, yeah, both are valid too, though, right? Like, obviously, especially now, trans representation is incredibly important, especially like laying out the history of how long these people have existed and the acknowledgement in stuff like the Met of like, hey, like, yeah, maybe Ovid didn't, know how to conceptualize the concept of a trans person, but like at the same time, he very much did in his own very specific way. And I mean, there's so much there's lots of examples beyond Ovid too in the ancient world, which is just, it's so nice. And so, yeah, like I also love to make that very clear, in my show. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, there really is not a lot of happy ending, like same-sex relationships at all, like, let alone women. There's almost no like, acknowledgement of women loving other women. But even when there are men, they tend to die. So it's like, it's nice to have this as possibly both, as like, yeah, this kind of thing where if you feel like that is representative of you, like, great, it's either one, like, and I think that's, yeah, a nice way of seeing it. There's lots of myths like that, but this is one that's particularly interesting. And so, like, I read your paper back when I did the episode, and then I admittedly didn't read it again. So
I try not to either.
I mean, great, I get that. I don't tend to listen back to anything that I do unless I absolutely have to. But so, like, what was it that you were kind of laying out in terms of this as like the the evidence, aside from, well, I mean feel free to reiterate all of it, actually. Like, yeah.
No, it's fair. So I guess the thing that struck me first about Iphis is I looked at the story, and this is this lovely story where you get this person born who the author Ovid tells us is born a woman, quote unquote, but then immediately told by her father says to her mother, you can't actually raise a daughter because there's no money, and so this child from day one is raised as a boy. And we don't really know much about how Iphis understands himself. We sort of do get a speech later on, but we get this this child who's raised as a boy, and then later in life falls in love with a young girl, doesn't really understand how that's going to work because there's no fun little sexual paradigm telling Iphis how to love a woman, and then in kind of through their mother's help, transforms, quote unquote, transforms, because exactly what that transformation is not entirely clear, but transforms into a man. I think one of the things that struck me when I was thinking about how am I going to make this argument was actually that transformation is weirdly understated, because what you get is something like Iphis' step got longer. His face grew and got more vigor in it, and he became stronger. And it's really like general stuff. It's not very explicit. And so, you know, being a kind of a myth nerd, I thought, well, let's go and have a look. What do the other versions of this story say? Like, Ovid can't be the first. What other versions of this story say? And there's like a similar story that clearly Ovid is basing the Iphis and Ianthe story on.
Is there really?
Yeah, from, I think, I'm going to say Antoninus Liberalis, although I might be wrong.
I was going to say, how did I miss this? But if it was Antoninus Liberalis, I can see why I would miss it. So that's
People would miss that. Have I got that right? Maybe. Whether I have... Oh, no, sorry, it's Nicander. I'm so sorry, it's Nicander.
No, another that I would... I don't even... That's
so we
like
don't
a name
have
that
the
I know
text,
familiar.
we have like a summary of it later. So it's one of those ones.
Yeah, love those. And by that I mean I hate them.
I hate them so much. And I think it's Antoninus Liberalis who references Nicander. So that's where...
Oh, good, right, yeah, one of those.
Yeah, one
like
of those.
One guy referencing another guy. Yeah.
But it really explicitly says in the Greek source that it's there as the goddess Leto, I think, rather than the goddess Isis, which is in Ovid, grew genitalia on a girl, grew male genitalia on a girl.
Huh.
So it's like super explicit.
Yeah.
And then Ovid doesn't do anything like that. And that really interested me. Like, why does Ovid, who has absolutely no qualms whatsoever about making a story sexual if it doesn't have to be, not do that
also,
here?
Yeah, I also want to remind the listeners too just how much, because that is so interesting, because not only that, but also like the whole point of including this character in this book is to have a transformation. And typically the transformation is fairly detailed because that's the entire purpose of the metamorphoses. So yeah, to have it be so inexplicit is really interesting.
Really odd. And it's, you know, without getting into the whole, like, what's going on in the literature sort of thing, there's something really weird going on in Book 9 of Ovid's Metamorphoses anyway, because all of the transformations are a bit odd there. You know, the story immediately before Iphis is the story of Byblis, who's a woman who's in love with her brother, and she writes in love letters. It's so weird. She writes in these love letters, and then she doesn't really, like, transform. Like, at the end of the story, she turns into a fountain, but it's described in about 4 lines, and you go... You didn't need a 250-line story to tell me that she transformed into a fountain in 4 lines, so what are you doing with metamorphosis and transformation at this point?
Yeah.
And then we have a story that's all about change, but the change itself seems really understated.
Yeah.
Which is odd, decidedly weird. So yeah, so I start from saying this is a transformation that's, like, understated.
Yeah.
And then I looked at the name and the fact it's a common name, and I thought, well, is it? Like, if we actually look at how this name is used in historical records and the, like, inscriptions and things like that, is it mostly used of men or mostly used of women? And the answer is basically, it genuinely is like a common name. Like, it really is.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Like, you know, Ovid picked a name that really was.
Yeah. And it's Greek too, right? Because if we think that he probably invented this name, though, or we you know, I think, have evidence of it before.
Yeah, I think we generally think no, he invented the name. He invents attaching it to this myth. So there's
right. Okay. No,
that's
what I meant.
Yeah.
But I mean, he picked a very Greek name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Picks a very Greek name and a name that is historically really associated with men, because there's an Iphis in the Argonautica and Jason the Argonauts.
Oh.
So you've already got, if you're reading it and you don't know anything about the story, your association is that's a man's name, even though you probably know women called that name.
Yeah.
I guess, like, as a person called Joe, I relate.
Yeah, fair.
There are women, but mostly it's a man's name.
As someone who was originally named Alex, I also agree.
Sure.
With
yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I looked at that, and then I thought, because I got confused basically. So Latin and Greek, awful languages, and they have cases, so they have multiple forms that words can appear in.
That's why I gave up on Latin very quickly.
Totally fair. And I thought, well, I don't know, how does this name work? There's a Greek name that's being talked about in Latin, in a Latin poem. Like, where's it getting its endings from? Are they kind of, because they look a bit Latin to me. I was looking at these look like Latin endings. There's a bit of Greek ending in there. So I started looking into the endings of the Greek name, how that works. And it turns out that in Greek, you have like a masculine Iphis that looks like Iphis sometimes, but then has different forms, and a feminine Iphis that looks like Iphis and has other forms. So they only really look alike in the form where they're Iphis. Otherwise, they look different.
Yeah.
But Ovid only has one form of the name, so he's kind of mixed together to some extent, probably the masculine and the feminine Greek endings. So you get this kind of already. You're associating it with a man, but it's got these blended endings and it has some feminine endings in it too. So on a grammatical level, it really interested me that this was a like blended name that we don't have great evidence for the name in Latin before Ovid. So we don't. It was really hard to make a case to how much blending Ovid's done and how much that's just what's happened over time to the name. But certainly, Ovid's done something to deliberately combine some forces here, which was really odd, I thought.
Yeah, so I guess because in Latin, and this is me not ever having read Ovid in Latin, and again having done first year Latin and then been like, no, because in the actual poem itself, wouldn't it? So it only appears as Iphis. It doesn't ever have like.
Sure. So it does appear in other forms, but a lot of the time it's not always explicitly clear whether it's taken. So I think the first time it comes up. This is at this point basing my memory on like not recent memories. This might be wrong.
So
I think it's Iphide mutata. So mutata is a feminine ending. So like with Iphis having been transformed, literally. So like that is feminine.
Yeah.
But then immediately afterwards you get like it's her grandfather's name. So you go, well then it's associated with a man. Then you get it in a very masculine form. So it's like it's undercut immediately. We kind of have to do the feminine thing because at this point in the story, Iphis is grammatically at least feminine. But then it immediately gets undercut. So there's this consistent like tension with the way Ovid's presenting that name. And from there I got really interested in like, okay, because Latin's a gendered language, everything is either masculine, feminine, or neuter. What other words does Ovid use of Iphis? Like, because every adjective would have to agree with the name, and then it would be a feminine, masculine. And at the early point in the story, there are a couple of feminine adjectives. Totally true. There's also a lot of like deliberately avoiding the gender. So some forms in Latin don't display gender, some do. And it's like Ovid prefers to use the forms that don't display gender at that early point in the story, which I thought was really interesting. And you even get lots of references to Iphis as like other things, just like metaphorically. So when Iphis is in the womb, he's a weight, and a weight is a neuter gender in Latin, a pondus. So like, again, it's deliberately not feminizing. You get kind of lots of things like this where I'm like, if Ovid wanted to exploit this kind of person who loves to exploit poetic forms and stuff, he would go out of his way to make these feminine forms, and he doesn't.
Yeah.
It seems to be deliberately underplayed to me.
Do you know how this compares to Caeneus and Caeneus? Because I'm curious about that. Yeah, because like I know like in the translations, that one I can't remember as well with Iphis, but that one tends Caeneus is pretty explicitly like Caeneus is a woman, and then Caeneus is a man, and it feels like that really explicit. Like so, do you know?
That is absolutely really explicit in
okay.
That. And there are like two really interesting things about that actually. So one is about the order in which we meet the character Caeneus, like what do we meet them in? Right. Because what we get told in terms of the storyline is we're at Troy, we're having the Trojan War, it's really violent, it's really bloody, and there's this great soldier on the battlefield called Caeneus, and he is killing people left and right. I've got that completely confused. We have a battlefield, and we've got Cygnus, the soldier Cygnus. He's killing people left and right.
But yeah. One of the swans.
One of the swan ones. One of those ones. And then we cut to a like campsite story time where Nestor is saying, actually, I once met a man who was just like Cygnus, who also couldn't be destroyed back in the like pre-mythic days before the Trojan War. And he was called Caeneus, and no one could ever defeat him. He was so great, he was so powerful. And there's just like this story who maybe was a woman.
Right.
So it's framed as like, meet the man who's Caeneus. Then there's this story of Caeneus, this rumor of Caeneus.
Yeah.
And we get that told, and we get this, the story that I'm sure your listeners are already familiar with, where this young Thessalian woman, Caeneus, is walking along the beach and is assaulted by Neptune, and it doesn't go great. But the first response she has is to go, you've done a horrible thing to me. I want you to make it so that I am no longer a woman. And what does that mean? Like, what does it mean not to be a woman? Does it mean to be a man? Or does it mean not to suffer the things she just suffered?
Yeah.
Like, Neptune makes a decision, and Neptune says, yeah, okay, what we're saying is that you want to be a man. And there's some evidence that maybe Caeneus then enjoys that, so potentially that was what he was asking for. But the question itself, or the statement itself, make me not a woman, is so ambiguous.
Yeah.
And again, people, like scholars, have gone in different directions on that. Is this just saying patriarchy is shit, which it is, so I don't want to be a woman under this system? Or is this saying, I actively want to be a man?
Yeah.
To me, in my reading, the fact that the first thing that Caeneus does after being transformed is go out and penetrate some Thessalian fields.
Yeah.
I'm like...
That's what I read too. I was like, this is what tells me that I'm going to read this story as a nice thing that happened instead of a horror show. Because it is, I mean, one, that's a more enjoyable way of reading it. Neptune is bad enough without, adding any more. But then, I forgot about that until you said it. I was like, oh, I can hear myself like reading that to the listeners because it was a lot. Yeah.
It's so, like, to me, that just feels like a deliberate, explicit thing.
Yeah.
But the other really interesting thing that's going on with Caeneus that I don't really talk about in the article, because I might have missed this 5 years ago when I wrote the article.
Well, you've got it now.
But, have the great opportunity when I'm teaching students now to be like, this is why scholarship can be rubbish, because sometimes your humble lecturer can fully forget or not put something in an article, but at least you get to have it in the classroom now, 5 years later. Is that Ovid doesn't invent the character Caeneus. Like, Caeneus has a literary history before he turns up in Ovid. And most of that's pretty simple, right? So he turns up in Homer. He's one of the heroes. It's all good. He turns up in the Argonautica, where he's one of the heroes there, and he's a great soldier. And that's where we first get the first idea that maybe his skin is unbreakable, which the Ovid really plays with, that his skin is unbreakable. But he also turns up in Virgil, and that's the thing I think I completely forgot when writing this article. Is so briefly he turns up in Virgil. But when he turns up in Virgil, it's during the like book 6 of the Aeneid, where Aeneas is going down into the underworld to find out about how great Rome is going to be.
Right.
And he goes down, he's just about to go and see Dido again after fucking her over in book 4. And he sees this crowd of women from mythology. And so he goes down, he sees like Phaedra and Euryphile and Pasiphae and all these kind of women from Greek mythology, particularly Greek tragedy. And he also sees Caeneus, who is called Caeneus there, so give him this like masculine name.
Yeah.
Who I think Virgil says was once transformed into a man.
Huh.
But has clearly, or maybe reverted back to being a woman once in the underworld.
Yeah.
And it's quite ambiguous, like exactly what's going on there. Once a man, now a woman is what seems to be the force there in the underworld. So that's whether Virgil invents that or not, we don't know. But there's already before Ovid this little suggestion that maybe we can play with the gender in this mythology a little bit. And actually, Caeneus has already turned up in the Metamorphoses at least once as well.
Right.
Back in book 8. So this story takes place in book 12.
Yeah.
Book 8, in the story of Atalanta and the Caledonian boar hunt.
Right. Because he's another one of those, right?
He's another one, exactly. He's another one of the ones.
He's like in every hero story.
Yeah, exactly. Which I think is all part of it. Like, if thinking about what your reader who's never read the Metamorphoses is reading and thinks he's named Caeneus, they go, I know that man. That is a powerful, heroic, superhero man from the Age of Heroes, from the Iliad, from all these other books. So I think Virgil's already saying, ooh, but what if he was a woman? And then Ovid goes, what if I can exploit this even more and make this into the whole story? What if the whole story is not really about him being this heroic man, but it's actually about how he became that heroic man?
Yeah.
Because in book 8, when he turns up, he's there, and I'll give you the Latin because it's quite, you could read it in a couple of ways. So it's a long category of all the heroes who are helping out Meleager and Atalanta kill Caledonian War. And we get Iam non femina Caeneus, so no longer a woman Caeneus.
Right.
But Ovid's not mentioned him before, so clearly Ovid's going, you remember in Virgil when he was a woman but is now a man and then was a woman again. Well, now he's no longer a woman.
Yeah.
And now 4 books later I'm going to tell you the story of why he's no longer a woman. So it's he's playing around with that so much deliberately.
Well, and I wonder if the Virgil is necessarily attempting to say that he was a woman again in the underworld, or was if he was just included because he was once a woman.
Yeah.
Because by saying Caeneus and not, well, though I guess we can't necessarily know if the name Caeneus would have been known as the alternative, but yeah, that's interesting.
He definitely says that. Yeah, and it's a little bit ambiguous because it's literally he goes as a companion also who was once a young man, now a woman, Caeneus.
Oh, okay.
Once again turned back into his old form by fate. But what's the old form? It's the old form, a man or a woman. It's...
Yeah. Huh.
It's so deliberately playing around with it. So Ovid just clearly goes, there's a myth I can exploit, and if I'm doing my poem all about transformation, here's a story where I can talk about transformation and look, maybe I'm not just transforming the gender of this character, I'm also transforming the literary tradition. Do you see what I did there? This is the sort of thing Ovid loves to do.
That's very Ovid. That's so interesting. I had a thought happen and then my brain lost it. What? I'm gonna lose it again. That's fine. No, that's really interesting. I'm fascinated by just like how Ovid plays with this stuff. And I mean, I guess I'm just like trying to wrap my head around just like all of it, I guess. But now seeing this comparison between Caeneus and Iphis is really interesting. Oh, that was what you said something earlier that I forgot, that the whole thing about Caeneus is that his skin, is what did you said unbreakable?
Yeah, unbreakable, because I think that's what from memory, I think that's what he's explicitly called in Apollonius of Rhodes Argonautica, so the kind of Hellenistic poem. He's unbreakable there,
Because all I can think about that is the alternative word being impenetrable.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the other, I think that was the thing that I realized in writing this article is that actually there is this paradigm, this system of masculinity at Rome that we associate particularly with the end of the Republic, so like the 40s, 50s BCE going through to the early Empire, so the kind of 20s, 30s BCE going through to like early decades CE, which is exactly when Ovid's writing, which is that masculinity is all about being impenetrable in so many different ways. Like impenetrable socially, because no one can come and mess with you. Impenetrable physically, because you shouldn't be stabbed by weapons. But also impenetrable sexually, because actually there's this whole thing that particularly comes out in 90s scholarship that being a man at Rome is about being a penetrator. That's a penetrator sexually. It's also a penetrator in like literary and philosophical ways, but and that's kind of how you can define a man as opposed to any of the other gender groups who are floating around Rome, like enslaved people and women and children. They're all the opposite to a man in that sense.
Oh, antiquity.
It's a joy, isn't it? It's one of those fun things my students sometimes look at me like, what are you talking about? When I'm like, yeah, we're going to have to use the word genders at this point, and we're going to have to talk about like women and children and enslaved people as a different gender to men, because if this is a gender construction and being a man is being a penetrator and they're not penetrating, then they're a different gender to men. And like, that's okay, actually.
Yeah.
Not in a way they liked or signed up to. But
yeah, really. my biggest thing that I've just been saying into so many episodes lately is that I'm just obsessed with the idea that Athenian women were off having sex with each other all the time because men did not have any, like, they didn't conceptualize sex as anything other than penetration. So they were just like, nah, the women are just hanging out. They're like looming together all the time. They, you know,
Just
they don't care.
weaving.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. I love that so much.
Yeah, like just this idea that's like it's just like all about that, because of course, like even in all of the male relationships in Athens, it was still all about who was penetrating whom.
Absolutely. Like, it all comes down to that, and you can see why that becomes such a fascination in the scholarship. It's like, this is such a weird model. It's such a specific model, like, and it doesn't get broken that often. Like, sometimes it gets broken, but not that often. So if Caeneus is like already mythologically impenetrable, and Ovid wants to stress that I'm making him into a man, then the way he gets to do that is by saying he's a man because he's impenetrable, and like those two things go together. And so after Nestor's telling this story in the battle scene, Nestor's telling this story about like Caeneus is a soldier, and it's the battle between the centaurs and the Lapiths, and Caeneus is now a young Lapith hero fighting the centaurs. He goes, well, I'm going to make it really explicitly that he is completely impenetrable and he can't be defeated by their swords. Read, they also can't fuck him. Like, he is totally indestructible because no one can enter him, and he's going to go and enter everyone else in the battlefield. And suddenly you begin to look at the descriptions of the battles that Caeneus does when he's fighting these centaurs, and it's like, he stabbed them, he put a big thing in them, he made a wound on top of a wound on top of a wound, and you go, oh no, this is not subtle from Ovid, like, at all.
Yeah.
This is really explicit.
Ovid did love to Ovid.
Of course, like, would he be the same poet if he wasn't, like, constantly having sex scenes that actually look like battle planting? No.
No, well, and I just, the penetrating the Thessalian fields was like just
it was like a preface to penetrating the like centaurs who were in those Thessalian fields later on.
Yeah, it's just like all of it. He liked to penetrate. That's all we know.
What can we say
Caeneus
about our boy Caeneus?
Yeah,
good for him.
But this transformation that does so explicitly make Caeneus a penetrator, you know, when he becomes a man, but is so subtle with Iphis, is such an interesting like comparison. Yeah. So I mean, did like, I imagine you talked about that, but like, did you come to any conclusions about like what this means or what it could mean?
I guess that this is one of those places where it's really nice to acknowledge that our modern world has given us a range of language that the ancients didn't necessarily have, and we can talk about like being at various spectrums various places on a spectrum of gender. That like not every man has to be Caeneus. Like, we can't all be Caeneus. Some of us are going to fall short of that. But you can have these different things that are both definitely masculinities, that are both definitely ways of being a man, but doing that in slightly different ways. Neither of them deviating too much from what it means to be a man at Rome, because to be a man at Rome has very specific rules, and as far as we can tell, they both meet those rules. Even though Ovid is really explicit about Caeneus being a penetrator, he still leaves room for us to think about Iphis as a penetrator too, because the very last line of the Iphis story, which is also the last line of Book 9, because it ends with this story, is a little votive offering that Iphis and Ianthe give to the goddess Isis. And they say, we thank you, the boy Iphis, potitur, his woman is the verb, and potitur is this verb which means like to possess, but usually to possess, or at least in Ovid very often, to possess in a sexual way. So he does end with this moment of penetration, even though it's kind of not explicit. There is the last moment of penetration. So they're both men, but they can be men in different ways, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, and that's basically what I would also think just from this conversation. Like, and I think that again is such a powerful like acknowledgement in the ancient world even of this kind of spectrum of the different forms, and you know the ways that for all that Iphis cares, he's a man. like he gets what he wants. He gets to marry Ianthe, like happily ever after. So like for all the ways that matters to either of these people, they are men.
Because I guess, that's a really interesting thing with the Iphis story that I don't think I ever really thought about. So, he's been raised as a man for probably the first 13 years of his life. The story specifies he's 13. What would it suddenly mean if he was uncovered and asked to live his life as a woman? Like, that would not be a natural state of affairs for him. For everyone who wants to push back and say, well, this is... Because, Iphis has this speech, and that's the thing we can't ignore, is that Iphis has this long speech, which is why I started looking into him in the first place, if you remember, going back to, like, these women, quote-unquote, these speeches, where he says, I'm really uncomfortable with everything. Everything's making me unhappy. Like, what is this world? And he brings out all these mythological examples and says, well, like, Pasiphae was pretty rubbish, but at least she got her man. Like, what does it mean that I can't even do that? Like, I'm so unnatural that I can't even get treated like Pasiphae did. That's a really disturbing thing to say about yourself. And people will point to this and say, well, this is the patriarchy. This is a woman suffering under the patriarchy, and she's not able to express her unhappiness in a kind of coherent way. So what she does is bring in these weird mythical examples in. And I can't, if someone wants to read it that way, that's totally fair. But to me, that just feels like someone who has no idea how to be a woman, what it would mean to be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
If the next day, Iphis speaks to Ianthe and Ianthe says, I don't want you, I want you to dress as a woman now, what would that, like, that wouldn't work either. And so there's definitely a lot of kind of trauma and discomfort in Iphis' speech there, but I don't think that necessarily equates to, like, I really want to be a woman either.
No, and it reminds me of there's a reading of the Medusa story of Ovid that goes around the internet all the time. This idea, because it's not in Ovid, it's this idea that the sort of some kind of background of this is that, Athena didn't transform Medusa to punish her, but to save her from future assaults. And the argument you're talking about this, the issue being the patriarchy, like, reads to me like that, which, like, on the surface feels feminist, it feels pro-women, but as soon as you just, like, scratch the surface just slightly, you realize that what that is not pro-woman at all. It is not anti-patriarchy. It is actually more like an agent of the patriarchy. It is more like the type of white women who have bought into the patriarchy so much that they can't see other genders and they can't see through the weeds, right? Like, so, like, because to suggest that the only way to gift Medusa with a lack of assault is to make her hideous or whatever, people want to read it, is, like, terrifying to me, or make her monstrous or whatever. Like, it not only erases the fact that in every single other version of Medusa ever, she is born a Gorgon. It's just, and she's not necessarily ugly. She's just literally who she is. That's just who she was. And, like, it erases that. And then, just like with Iphis, it erases the fact that it is very explicit that he is like, no, like, I mean, literally the story is that he and his mother know that he is biologically female. And nobody else knows. And he's lived his entire life with everyone, his father included, believing he is a man. Like, this is not somebody who's like, I feel like a woman and I'm being forced not to be. Like, no, it sounds more like gender dysphoria. Like, it sounds more like somebody who is figuring themselves out and is like, no, like, I would just like that my gender, like, affirmed. Like, I would like Isis, through transformation to affirm my gender. And like, I think that, to suggest that, like, that it's a patriarchy, it's just like, I mean, I'm not one to say that something is not the fault of the patriarchy, because everything is, let's be honest. But like, it to me doesn't read like that in this case. It reads like, like if it just wants them that they've known for their entire life to be affirmed via goddess interaction.
And it's so tied up with loving Amphi. Like, that is the thing that matters at the end of the day. Like, everything else, like, what we don't see in Iphis' story at all is, like, a love of masculine behavior outside of sex. A love of, we don't see any relationships where Iphis enjoys being referred to as a man or anything like that. We see he loves this woman. The way he wants to love this woman is as a man. Therefore, that's how the story works for him. And I think, like, it's totally reasonable to say that that's maybe not the most positive representation of trans identity in the universe.
Well,
but
the ancient world isn't known for good. It's more just that they existed back then.
And, like, why should we expect Ovid to give us a good representation of trans identity?
Well, yeah.
Like, I totally don't. What I do think is important is that readers, whether they're trans or not, can look at Ovid and pull out this stuff. Even if Ovid didn't intend it, even if none of it is based in reality. And there is some really interesting suggestion we have some really obscure references to sex change operations in historical documents, right? And they don't have a clue what's going on biologically. Like, these descriptions make it very clear they don't understand how a sex change operation would work. But
they're still thinking about it.
It's something that is at least perceived to be plausible within the world. And it doesn't matter whether it was or not, because so many things that we think about today were not plausible in the ancient world. But we don't really read the text and think they don't exist. Like,
well, that's the thing. Like, all of this is not to be seen as, like some great ancient trans story that makes everyone happy and everyone gets what they want. It's evidence that even in the ancient world, there were people who were born in a body that did not feel like the right one to them. And it was acknowledged in some way in these ancient sources. Like, it's literally just evidence that the concept of somebody feeling that they are the wrong gender, like, existed. I mean, there's also I don't know if you know much about this, and I will be doing more research, hopefully, but like, I meant, like, just came up, but there's the, like, emperor.
Yeah.
Who was like, I'm a woman. Yeah.
I am so not a historian, to the point that sometimes my students, like, ask me about battle, and I'm like, look, I don't know. I'm sorry.
I'm the same. I just covered the Bronze Age for a month, and I'm like, that was all my assistant producer writing that, and me going, this sounds smart, Michaela. Thank you.
And as, like, so this is going to be the most uninformed take ever about Elagabalus, because I fully don't know.
That's great. So am I. We'll just talk about it.
As I understand it, it's one of those things where we have some sources that don't love Elagabalus, that are later than Elagabalus, and think, what's a really good way we can insult Elagabalus, and that's to use feminizing language. But at the same time, you don't make that kind of story up about someone out of thin air. Because the story's presumably got to mean something to the person who's reading it. They've got to go, actually, I recognise this story about this empress, and I can kind of identify with them. Yeah. And also, why am I looking to I think it's the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, the writers of the history of the later kind of emperors? Why am I looking to them to give me a good trans narrative? Like, I fully don't need to. But if a person who reads that story goes, enough of the pieces here are coming together that I can sort of make a puzzle out of them, why shouldn't they? Like, I don't know enough about the story to know how much there is in the original text, but... Yeah.
No, I don't know. I just remember hearing that there's, like, I don't know if it's a quote or maybe somebody attributing a quote, but basically saying that I want to be a woman or something like that.
Entirely, like, plausible.
Yeah. I mean, and if anything, again, like, basically what you're saying is, like, it's still proof the concept of gender, at least, like, identity not matching biology. It was at least conceptualized. Even if it was used as an insult, it is still proof that it was a concept.
Absolutely. And there are so many of these stories, because the problem with this sometimes is that you need to spend so long when you're talking about these stories in a public context, defending the possibility that they can be read through a queer or a trans lens, that you end up spending all your time doing that and not just saying, look at how many of them are. And you get, like, you've got these ones in Ovid, you've got stories in Lucian of this character Megillus, who is undoubtedly some kind of trans masculine. You've got the various groups of people at Rome who are not filling normative gender categories, even if they are maybe somewhere on a trans spectrum. So you've got the Caeneus, who are these kind of, like, I mean, if you want to take the general definition of them, they're people who like to receive anal sex, but that's also complicated in various places. But they're not occupying, like, a typical masculine gender. Sometimes they're described with feminine pronouns, feminine adjectives in Latin. You've got the Tribides, who maybe do or do not exist, but anyway, they're talked about in literature, who are a group of quote-unquote women who perform extremely masculine behaviours and have been theorised more recently as being trans men too. You've got, the Galli, who are this group of priests for the goddess Cybele, who ritually castrate themselves, which is not in and of itself gender transformation, but so many of the stories about them treat them also like they're undergoing gender transformation. That all of this together, and I kind of wanted to just give you like a throwing list of them, because when you take it all together, you go, the number, like, normativity is just that. It's a particular group of normal people in the world who behave in a normal way, but there are so many people who deviate from that. And deviation does not have to necessarily mean trans or queer, but it doesn't mean we can preclude or not use those labels either if they're appropriate and they fit. And I don't necessarily want to make it sound like I'm saying that every single one of those groups is definitely trans.
No, yeah. But
they're all definitely queer, because they're all saying fuck you to normativity and to normal rules about gender and how you do gender.
Yeah, they're all going beyond the standardized binary in some way. Yeah, exactly. I knew of the priests, but I didn't know of the other two examples. That was really
so interesting, and they're not mythological, right? They always turn up. So particularly,
I also don't care about Rome all that much unless people tell me about it. I like when people come on and tell me about Rome, but I don't like to read about it. It's too much.
That's very fair. Now, the Caeneus are really fascinating. They turn up mostly in kind of various abuse poetry, so like Roman satire, Roman epigram, things where people are kind of having a go at each other, which doesn't help with
I've never heard the
context.
term abuse poetry before. Sorry, that really got me. That was really good.
Oh, Hipponax and Archilochus are an absolute hoot. I mean, there's some horrible sexual assault in there too, so they're not totally a hoot. But there's some great stuff in there.
Yeah.
But no, so you see them, like Marshall's a great example, where he'll just talk about a group of people and saying, women these days don't even like real men. They like Caeneus. And you go, what the fuck's a Caeneus? Like, what does it mean to say they like Caeneus?
Is this like a connection to like the island? Is it an island or is it the town? Like, I'm just thinking of the Aphrodite of Caeneus, which is so famously like,
Yeah, so not like, but more, so not Caeneus, but Caeneus with an actual I in there.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But yeah, and it probably means something like mover, like kinetic.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And it's probably to do with them like dancing with their buttocks and shaking them to like come and fuck me kind of vibes.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they turn up, and again, these are men. The texts talk about them as men, but some texts also give them like the crowd of Caeneus who are like women, and you go, that's an Apuleius. They turn up as a crowd of female Caeneus, and you go, well, yeah, I guess they are deviating from a masculine idea of gender there. So these groups, they're all over the place, and to kind of rigidly say that Rome exists on a gender binary, when the Romans themselves fully understand that the man who penetrates is a particular kind of man, and everyone else isn't necessarily like a real man. And I'm not using the word real men because that's what like Marshall does. He talks about the wary weary, the real men, as opposed to all of these quote unquote men who are getting fucked and therefore not real men.
Yeah. It's so, I mean, the ancient world, because like I'm just connecting this all to Greece, which of course has like very similar and very different, like, but it's got all the same deviations, all the same like beyond these binaries issues. I also just have to say, this made me think of this, but I recently wrote a big thing on Medusa, and so I did a dive into like almost any ancient source that I could find that ever mentioned her in any way. And there, I believe, it was Diodorus Siculus who wrote about how, because there's a lot of versions that want to like rationalize her and be like, this is where the story came from, right? And I think his is like the one where it's like, oh, the Gorgons were actually like the Amazons, like another race of warrior women, and they actually fought the Amazons, but then and they were like all amazing and they were so good at what they did and all this, and then Heracles came and killed them all because as the leader of men, he was not willing to let any woman lead any country, so he killed them. and then but explicitly when Diodorus like explains about them and like how powerful as warriors they were. He says they're nothing like women of today. And I'm just like, okay, cool. So like, even when you want to acknowledge this like race of women who, you know, by Roman standards were going to be like men, like that's right,
Yeah,
obviously
sure.
the kind of purpose behind it. He's like, there used to be women who were like men. They're nothing like the women of today. Because the whole idea is like, well, the women of today are not men because real men, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, it was such like it was one of the few sources where I was like, oh, I'm really torn on this. Half of it is really cool and half of it is utterly horrifying.
But that's so indicative, I think, of how of like what a Roman author does when they encounter a strong woman and how they're going to deal with it, which is
they're like, it's old and nothing like now.
Exactly. And I think actually, like, if we look at the warrior women who turn up in Latin texts, like, they are so obviously treated not as women in a sense. And I think such a great example, like, even, let's stay with the Metamorphoses for a bit, is like Atalanta, when she turns up in Metamorphoses. She is like explicitly a woman. There's none, you know, there's gender play, but it's not gender play in a way you're ever going to go, there's a man.
Yeah.
But the text doesn't know what to do with her because she has to be sexy. Because, you know, woe betide a woman be anything other than sexy.
Yeah.
So Ovid goes out of his way to say, look, she's gorgeous, her hair streams over her back, her body's like ivory. You know, it's this really erotic description of her. But at the same time, she's like beating men all the time. And like, how does he reconcile this like sexualized woman and the fact that she is beating all the men?
Yeah.
Ovid doesn't give us the story that like Hyginus does, where she chases them with swords and kills them all. But, you know, he doesn't know what to do with that. He doesn't know how to gender her.
I'm gonna like just mix up what source is what because I haven't looked at Atalanta in a while. But because when I last looked at Atalanta, I was really interested in separating her into two different forms. Like the one who's super powerful and does all this incredible stuff, and then the other one who falls for a golden apple and then has to get married. Because to me, because also there's very explicitly sources that suggest that she's from two very different places and has two very different backstories. So I was like, okay, I like the idea of two different Atalantas. Because also it doesn't fucking make sense with her character in the other story to like make that. But does Ovid have the apples? Do you know?
Yeah, so
he does.
Here's where I fully admit that particular episode of your podcast inspired me to write an article about Atalanta.
Fuck off!
Absolutely, because you were stressing so hard how these two different women, and Ovid has two different Atalanta stories, but they're kind of not different women.
Yeah,
they kind of are and aren't different women.
Well, yeah, because Ovid wouldn't want to be like, no.
Yeah, wouldn't want to be simple.
Yeah.
And that's what really interested me, because you went through the sources and you're so right. The other sources are so explicit about these being different women.
Yeah.
And it's not just Ovid who does this, but Ovid does this to a greater degree than any other Roman poet. He sort of kind of blends them a little bit, and in some places it's explicitly confused. So there's, I think Ovid mentions Atalanta like about 15 times across all his poetry. And on one occasion, it's definitely unambiguously a blended figure who's like a bit of the Caenean Atalanta and a bit of the Boeotian Atalanta. But in the Met specifically, he does mix them together. So you get the story of the Caledonian boar hunt in Book 8, which is all, you know, it's pretty standard, the Caledonian boar hunt, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't deviate too far from the mythology. But the language that's used of her there gets really explicitly picked up when he tells the story of Caenean Atalanta, of Arcadian Atalanta. That's the wrong way around. But the one whose father is Caeneus, the one who does the apples and the foot race.
That's where the word, No, because I feel like the Arcadian one is the one who was raised by bears. Because
you're so right.
Yeah, because it's all about bears.
Yeah, you're so right. Arcadian Atalanta's Book 8,
but it's confusing because of where Caledon is. Because so I'm with you.
But yeah, the Book 10 Atalanta is described like in very similar ways to the Book 8 Atalanta, and there are some very deliberate like textual things Ovid does when he's describing the Book 8 one to say, keep your eyes peeled, she's going to come back later, and then she does. So that really kind of got me thinking, these are two different women who Ovid wants to blend into one woman because they're both doing gender-defying things, and it's so explicitly about gender. So you get, I think it's in the Book 8 description where she's described as like having the face, a face that would seem girlish in a boy or boyish in a girl. And you go, okay, I know Atalanta, we've hung out, you know. And then in Book 10, when the character comes back, the same description is applied to Hippomenes, her lover. that he has a face that's like boyish in a girl, girlish in a boy. And you go, so you're connecting these two stories, aren't you? Going out of your way to make me connect them together.
Yeah.
So there definitely is weird gender stuff going on there.
That's so interesting. I definitely did not. I was just like, the Atalanta of it all. I feel very vindicated. Thank you so much for telling me that. But also, like, I'm trying to think back on my sources now. Like, is it that, because they really do appear, it's Ovid who really is the only one who does like a full comprehensive anything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it makes sense that he would be like, nah, they're the same.
They turn up super briefly. I think one of them, the one with the foot race, turns up briefly in Hesiod's Catalogue of Women.
Yeah, right.
And I think the other one might turn up in somewhere else in Hesiod. Don't quote me on that, maybe. But they both have ancient histories.
Exactly. Yeah, they're both have very ancient origins, and definitely like, you know, there's stuff in both the regions, and I know there's a lot of like fragments that suggest that she is very ancient as a character.
Yeah.
But yeah, like there was it would make sense if Ovid was the first one to make them into one, or even if he's not doing it explicitly, to lead modern people to be like, there's one Atalanta.
Yeah, at least to play them together in a really explicit way. I made a little table about like which different Atalantas turn up in different stories.
So thrilling.
Which was really nerdy of me.
But
it is basically, Ovid who mixes them together and makes things a bit more confusing. And it's this weird reference in his Iphis where he can't decide which Atalanta it is. Clearly, in that particular moment, he mixes them together there too.
Interesting.
But they're pretty explicitly separated out before that, until you get to the story of, I think it's Apollonius Rhodius? Not Apollonius Rhodius. Pseudo-Apollodorus, that's the one. Tells where he goes, I don't know, she was maybe 3 different people and maybe had 4 different boyfriends. I can't tell you anything more than that, I'm sorry. So, you know, and he's probably post-Ovid, so he's probably drawing at that point already on this tradition where they've been re-blended.
He does a lot. He has a lot of like things that are almost certainly coming from Ovid. Yeah. Huh.
So she's fascinating. So thank you for putting me onto that, because I fully went down that rabbit hole because of that episode.
This is thrilling. So you wrote an article about it?
Yeah.
Could you send it to me?
Absolutely, definitely.
I'm thrilled.
It's very like literary because it's all about genre and stuff.
No, but I love that. I mean, I'm just thrilled that my like the thing I was like, I'm gonna make 2 different episodes because I'm mad that turned into something more legitimate.
So I'm happy to know it, but it was just really odd to me.
Yeah.
Together in this way.
I think that also Jennifer Saint was inspired by my episode. Sorry, I just have to say, like, apparently my Atalanta episodes have just done more than I thought. So I'm just this is a feel good moment for me.
Very fruitful. They've gone on to create so many things. That's so brilliant.
Sorry, you were saying
no, I can't remember what I was saying. Probably just that if Ovid sees an opportunity to mess with things and mess with time and mess with what you expect a story to be about, he fully will. Because while we're at Atalanta, just a sidetrack totally in Atalanta. For Ovid, she is the epitome of like sexual. So in the Ars Amatoria, I think you've read the Ars Amatoria in the show, right?
I sure have. Yeah.
The end of book 3, so the literal climax of the whole poem, the last mythological character who turns in the Ars Amatoria is Atalanta, where she's explicitly turning up because she's got great legs. So if you have sex with her in certain positions, you'll be able to look at her legs better. And she's in this catalogue of like different positions you can have sex with different women in because they have different like physical features. And I love that Ovid's like goodbye to mythology in the Ars Amatoria is put Atalanta's legs over your shoulder because they look great. Fantastic. No notes. 10 out of 10.
The Ars is like so joyfully fucked up.
So fucked up.
Yeah. I mean, Ovid, like, for all that I absolutely love the Met and the Ars for very different reasons, but like really I just think a lot about the ways in which our modern understanding of Greek mythology have been forever altered by that man just being, and he didn't know, he was just like, I'm writing a thing. This is like a fun poem I'm writing. I'm going to take a lot of inspiration from Greek myths. I'm going to change some stuff because I want to. And then 2,000 years later, people are like, Medusa was a priestess of Athena and she was beautiful and she was transformed. And I'm like, it's a thing that he made up because it was funsies. Like, yeah. And it now with Atalanta too, I'm like, because every book you pick up now that's just called Greek mythology. I mean, even mine probably says it, even though I hope I made a point, but that was years ago. So who's to say? Like, but you know, everyone's like, this is one Atalanta. She was incredibly heroic. She did an amazing and wonderful things. She didn't want to marry a man, except there was this time that she got really distracted by a golden apple, and so she married a guy. Yeah. Like, it's just,
But I love what you said that Ovid didn't know what he's doing. I think Ovid fully knew what he's doing. I think the Met is so intentionally.
Oh, I mean, like that he didn't. He didn't expect that 2,000 years later people would be like, "This is the Greek myth," is what I mean.
No, that's fair. There's so much like knowingness, and like sometimes, you know, I've been reading the Met for years, and I wrote a whole PhD on the Met. Like, the Met is my poem inside out, and still sometimes I'm reading it, and I just go, "What the fuck did you? Sly dog, like how did you slip that under my nose for the last 9 years when you've been making this clever little reference here? I've never picked up on that before. That's genius." And it's such a knowing poem about like how can I change everything and make it Roman, but more importantly make it mine, because like, if it's Roman, I don't want it to be like Augustus's or any emperors or anything. It's mine, and that's, I mean, I know you've done the read-throughs on your podcast, but the way the Met ends with that, such an exclamation of like, for all of time, I will be read. Like, foreign lips will read my words. You go, you had such a big idea of yourself of it, and you're right to be fair.
I mean, like it worked. Yeah. Like, you know, we can't say he didn't succeed.
He did kind of eat. I can't critique that.
Yeah. I forget what I was reading. I think I was just reading I've just been like finding random like indie published novels lately that I can just like buy for cheap and read and not remember anything after I finish reading them, but enjoy it in the moment. And I definitely like this morning read something where somebody just referenced Ovid in some book. I think it was like a fantasy book, and somebody was like, I'm gonna read Ovid. Like, I just think, like he really, I mean, the dude got around. Like, he's just been everywhere.
And it's so like the history of Ovid when you get into the Middle Ages and medieval period, like so much of why we think of Greek mythology as being Ovid did this is because he becomes the source book for painters. You know, and you get those lovely moralized versions of Ovid. You know, there's the French Ovid moralisé, and there's one in Latin called the Ovid moralizatus. Which are just like Ovid if you made him Christian. But then also let's use this to inspire every Titian painting and every Giotto painting for the next 400 years. So that our imagery of like what, like if you Google any mythological character, you're going to get some kind of Renaissance painting of them.
Oh yeah.
And our whole like way we think about it is so focused on how Ovid told those stories. Like one of my favorite paintings is Titian's Diana and Actaeon. It's that wonderful one where Diana's chasing him and her bow's pulled and he is falling to the floor and he's half turned into a stag but not fully, so his head's a stag and his arms are human still. It's gorgeous. I'm Googling that.
Yeah.
And it's so directly lifted from Ovid, like down to the colour of like which are the three dogs who are biting Actaeon. They're the three dogs who run ahead in the race in Ovid. You know, it's so taken from that story.
Wow.
And I think that's so much of it is that no one paints the Greek myth until like you get to the Pre-Raphaelites, you know.
Well, and then there's also the Latin of it all, right? Just how much more readable Latin was for so long, and how much more people were taking in Greek things via Latin, you know? So, yeah, I mean, it's unsurprising and also incredibly annoying. Like, just this Medusa thing made it so clear to me because I'm just like, I'm so deeply over Ovid's version of her. And I'm just like, I just want the Greek. But like, even there's this History Channel video that I saw in my research. And I mean, yeah, it's the History Channel. But it has like I assume that most of the talking heads on it are, you know, also fairly well known. But one of them I did know personally. And it presents this entire story of Medusa and all of these experts and all of this stuff, and it says the Greek myth over and over and over again, and then proceeds to tell Ovid's version of the story. And I just am it's still like this thing that's Ovid. She's just done so much. Anyway, this is not about Medusa, even though my head can make everything.
No, but let's make it about Medusa briefly, because
please.
My obsession with Medusa at the moment with regards to Ovid is which Ovid version, because Ovid tells two in the Metamorphoses, but one of them is 3 words long, so everyone misses it.
Yeah,
you get the whole book 4 story that's really detailed. Then in book 6, in Arachne's tapestry, Arachne's stitching all of these women who've been assaulted by the gods.
Yeah.
And one of them, in genuinely like a line and a half of the Latin, so probably like a line of any English translation, is Medusa. But it's a different story.
What is it? Oh, fuck.
Because
I already made it in this book.
It's got to be a different story because she's already got snaky hair when Neptune assaults her.
Right.
Which
so the Greek
doesn't make sense. Yeah.
It's just the Greek version?
Just the Greek version. Mm-hmm. But also, we get absolutely no reference to the Temple of Athena stuff. It's only half a line long, so you've got to expect that. But moreover, Neptune's a bird.
Okay.
Like, Neptune is not a bird. You feel that in book 4, when Perseus is telling that story about Medusa getting assaulted, he would mention if Neptune was a bird.
For sure.
He doesn't. And so in this like brief half-line version...
But also, why would Neptune be a bird in any case?
So, this is like something I delved into very deeply, because Neptune is never a bird. This is the only time in all mythology Neptune is a bird. And the best bit about this is that this is explicitly like a story for how Pegasus came about. So Pegasus... But why would he be a bird?
For why would it be a bird? Yeah, why would it be a bird? Because she's going to give birth to a fucking horse.
Because and Neptune's the god of horses. Like, it's such an obvious... He turns into horses in so many mythologies.
He assaults another goddess as a horse.
As a horse. Another goddess who turns up next on that tapestry, by the way.
Fuck off!
Yeah, exactly, as a horse. But it's so obvious that he should be a horse when he gives birth to a horse, or rather causes someone else to give birth to a horse. But he's a bird, and I can only think that that's Ovid/Arachne deliberately going, you think you know the story of Medusa from book 4, this is a different story. Like, he's got them both.
Yeah. I'll sort of realize how many times I've said fuck off, as that's not totally common, and I apologize.
It's totally okay.
It does show just how impressed and excited I am. That's just how I react. I swear, when I can't think of anything else to say. Slash when I feel like somebody could take it. But that's really fucking interesting.
Yeah.
There, I did it again. The bird is so weird because I want it, I love though that she already has the snaky hair because that's the stance that I just think is kindest to her, to the Greek origins, to the story, is just that I still think she was assaulted by Poseidon. Totally. I think that is very explicit in the Hesiod, even if nobody agrees with me. Mm-hmm. That's not true. Some people agree with me, but not the men on the internet. But it just makes so much sense. She was literally just born that way. It's so much kinder to be she wasn't ugly. She was just a monster. Monsters don't have to be ugly. They just have to be inhuman.
Yeah.
And she was terrifying, but she was terrifying because she could protect herself, not because she was going to come get you. You know, and the Athena thing is just so unnecessary. In Ovid, I mean, and just, I don't know. It's so interesting. And also one thing I recently sort of just registered is just that Ovid does not call her a priestess of Athena or of Minerva, even though half the people who read, who conceptualize Ovid's version are she was a priestess, and it's no, she was just in the temple.
In a temple.
And people just went into temples. That was very normal.
And there are some pretty good reasons why a young, presumably virginal Greek woman might be in a temple to Athena. That's a perfectly reasonable thing for her to be doing.
Incredibly normal. Yep.
Yeah. But no,
Yeah.
it's so interesting how like we think we know things about Ovid or even about Greek mythology, and so often we just have sort of got a kind of maybe half created version that we've added things to,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm sure I've
Yeah.
done all the time too. But it's so
I mean, yeah, it's hard because you do end up taking it in from all of these sources, even if you are reading the ancient sources. Like, it's still like we're just existing in the 21st century where so much has become seemingly like canon, quote unquote, you know, in whatever way, and it's easy sometimes to be like, or to forget, or just like overlook the fact that like, oh wait, that's not actually from the ancient world at all.
Mhm. I think for me that's so much of what's happening on Arachne's Tapestry. I think Arachne's Tapestry is a whole other mess in that like so much is going on there, and there are so many ways to
Yeah.
read it. A bit like what we were saying
Yeah.
with like Iphis. There's so many ways
Yeah.
you can read it. But to me, it's so notable how nearly every single story on there is either not the version we have elsewhere, or really different to the version we have elsewhere, or deliberately picks up on the less common way that story is told. That it seems to me that that's just a consistent catalogue of Arachne saying not only what's going on with gender and the gods and the mortal women and or indeed the goddesses, but also let me show you all of these untold stories, all these like paths the Metamorphoses could have gone down, and told you all these stories that, you know, we don't get a story of Asteria in the Metamorphoses, even though she turns into an island. That's so peak Metamorphoses vibes. She turns into an island. We don't get that except for like this brief reference in Arachne's Tapestry.
Yeah.
And even there, it's the wrong way round, because on Arachne's Tapestry, we have that Jupiter turns into an eagle and assaults her. Every other version of that myth tells you that she turns into a quail and runs away from Jupiter.
And this is Asteria, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
That's
But
really...
We could go through like Arachne's Tapestry line by line. Almost every story does this, where it's not the version you expect, or it's slightly different to the version you expect, or it's just as like messing with it. And I think it's just this explosion of like, if the Metamorphoses had an extra 20 books, what could have been in them? Like,
yeah. Well, and it's almost like this kind of acknowledgement that Ovid was like, I did the stories the way I wanted to in the Met, but here are the other versions.
And I know the other versions, like, and I can fully tell them if I wanted to. And that, so many of the stories, when you really get deep into them, have that, like, a little acknowledgement of the other version of the story just hiding behind it, which is beautiful. And when I show this to students, you can always tell they're just like, this man, how dare he?
Yeah, I mean, Ovid.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I think that a lot, just generally.
Yeah.
like everything about him.
Good and bad.
There's so many contradictions. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good and bad. Like, I'm very torn about how I feel about him.
Yeah.
In an enjoyable way. To kind of like link it back up to Iphis, because of I could talk about everything forever.
I got very off topic there.
Oh, I love a good off topic, absolutely. And I've literally like I could keep you for hours talking about Arachne, but I will not. But maybe we'll talk about the future. But I meant to ask this earlier. I would love to know if you have any thoughts on why it is that it's Isis who changes him.
Sure. So there's like a more obvious and a less obvious answer, I think.
Great.
I think the more obvious answer is hidden in the description of the parade of Egyptian gods who turn up at the beginning of the myth.
Okay.
So right at the beginning of the myth, just after Iphis' mother Telethusa has fallen pregnant and has realised, what if it's a girl? If it's a girl, I'm going to be screwed. She has this dream in which a load of different Egyptian gods and goddesses come to her.
Right.
And it's all the usual suspects, you know, all the kind of Egyptian goddesses there. And then you get Isis and you get Osiris. And Osiris and Isis are kind of partnered here, as they often are in mythology. And Isis has very prominently these two gleaming horns that are super phallic and look like dicks. And Osiris, very particularly, is described there as often as being the god who is always looking for his penis, because of the story that, you know, his body gets chopped up and it's like missing. But Ovid doesn't have to mention the fact that Osiris is looking for his penis and is missing his penis, or that Isis is this goddess with penis horns. And I do think that's like your little hint as a reader this is going to be a story about characters whose genitalia doesn't necessarily match up to their genders.
Interesting.
We have the goddess that for all intents and purposes, female-bodied person, although she's mostly cow-bodied. But female cow-bodied person who is got extra appendages, and then this male-bodied god who's lacking his appendages.
Yeah.
So that to me seems like a really good reason as to why it's Isis.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other one, I guess, generally is that, because I think I mentioned earlier if we have Antonius Liberais correctly recording Nikander's version from the Hetera Eumena, then it's the goddess Latona there. So it's not Isis at all. Mm-hmm. I think the other reason why it's Isis there has to do with what Isis is doing in the Metamorphoses more generally, which is that she's the character Io who turns up right at the beginning, and Ovid wants to draw connection. There's this tradition that the Greeks like to bring about, that Herodotus, I think, is the first one to mention, that when Io has been turned into a cow after being assaulted by Jupiter, she goes on a wander all around the world and eventually turns into the goddess Isis when she reaches Egypt.
Yeah. It's their way of being like, we are a little bit older than the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys?
We actually have this woman who did all of the colonialism because she wandered everywhere, made it all Greek.
Yeah. And then she gave birth to babies who then went on to found the Peloponnese, and so here we are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But Ovid deliberately draws connections between Isis in Book 9 and Io in Book 2 and 1, as if to kind of make you remember that that's a character who's already turned up. Now, Io doesn't have that much weird stuff going on with gender, but she does have weird things going on with her body and a certain dysphoria about her body. With this beautiful scene in Book 2 where Io looks into a river or into a lake, I think, a puddle or something. And that's the first time that she realizes that she's been turned into a cow.
Right.
And you get that bit where she tries to speak and she can't speak. And there's do you remember Eidolon, the kind of lovely online feminist classics journal that lasted for 5 minutes?
It closed before I really got into the world of academia through this. It was too bad, but yeah.
There was a great article in there, but this is fully from memory, so if I've got this person's name wrong, I'm so sorry. I think by someone called Sasha Barish, which was talking about comparing the Io and the Isis story. The Io story and the Iphis story.
Right.
And saying that, like, for their experiences, they didn't identify, and I'm so sorry, I cannot remember what flavour of trans Sasha Barish was, but they were saying that they didn't identify with the Iphis story as a story of dysphoria, but the Io story, they absolutely do. This moment of looking in the mirror and seeing a body that's not the body you think should be there, and that disconnect. Now, all of that to say, I do wonder if there is something really subtle about having Isis, the goddess who in her own life, her own period of experience, had a bodily disconnect. And the Ovid has explicitly told us she had a bodily disconnect. And she turns up here with her kind of penis-like horns that aren't quite befitting of this female goddess. And all of that connects to the very scene that Iphis will have when he stands there and says, "What is my body? I don't understand this. How do I make this work? How do I love this woman?" That's maybe really tinfoil hatty. But it seems to me, if you're going to choose a goddess to do that, she's a really good pick.
Well, and she is quite a unique pick. Like, I don't know if does he set it in Egypt, or I think he just kind of is vague about where it's happening, right?
The story of Iphis explicitly takes place in Crete.
Okay, so he's got that like kind of southern connection.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's intentional. I mean, obviously Isis also by the time of Ovid, like just for the listeners, like Isis was a fairly large goddess in the more classical world of Greco-Roman everything, but still it's a very you're choosing a like historically Egyptian god and aligning them with other like Egyptian gods that didn't become as popular, and
Ovid goes out as a way to make her like Egyptian in that story by including all these other ones, and they've got instruments that are rattling, and he goes out his way to make this an Egyptian scene. If you want me to get even more tinfoil hatty briefly.
Do you have time? I have time.
I always have time for tinfoil hats.
The
story of Byblis that's just happened has involved. So the story of Byblis goes straight into the story of Iphis, and they're connected into one another. So Byblis ends by turning into a fountain, and Ovid says that's a really weird thing. Crete's famous for really weird things. For example, do you know about the story of Iphis? So they're deliberately connected to that very tenuous line of weird shit happens.
That's so funny because like Crete is known for very weird things, but like not Iphis.
Not Iphis. No, she's not super associated with Crete because Ovid mostly makes this story up.
Yeah.
And she's Cretan, or he's Cretan, or they're Cretan in the Nicander version because that happens at Paestum.
Okay.
Phaistos.
Oh, yeah.
Mixing my Latin and my Greek together, Phaistos.
So fair. I can't imagine dealing with both. I only know the disc, so
exactly. That's where I went to. Was like the disc.
Yeah.
So that's also on Crete. But Byblis has been on this long journey, this like ridiculously kind of incomprehensibly long journey. After, so to recap the story again, she tries to sleep with her brother. He says no. She keeps trying to sleep with her brother. He runs away. She gets sad. She runs away. And there, presumably, the story takes place in the west coast. Have I got my directions right? I'm really awful. Yeah, the west coast of Turkey, right? So
yeah,
Asia
that's
Minor
what I was thinking too. Yeah,
like Caria, that kind of area. And she ends up by the end of her story, like in the Levant. So she goes on this massive, big journey across what we would now call Turkey and down into what we now call the Levant. I think ends up probably somewhere in Lebanon and Syria. Which is obviously an incomprehensibly long journey for someone to run while crying the entire time.
Yeah. Connected with Io, though.
But connected directly with the route that Io goes. And that's my tinfoil hat connection.
Yeah.
Is that it's
clearly, I mean, I'm on the same page.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah.
It's a one-size-fit-all tinfoil hat. But yeah, maybe there's this, I mean, it's the sort of thing that Ovid would do to trace that same route that Io does just before he brings Io back on stage and reminds you, look, I did Io in book 2, I'm doing Io now as Isis in book 9. It's the same, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly seems at the very least that he was like, hey, this is a connection I could make. Like even if he's not making some big depth thing about it, like he's like, like, I mean, I wonder if there's something, this feels like it would be not necessarily kind to the story of Iphis and Ianthe, but like, I wonder if there's some kind of connection in that, look, Byblis didn't get the man she loved.
No, I think that is totally fair, though.
Okay.
Because book 9, like, does have these weird, like, bad love stories that don't quite go right. And that pushes on into book 10, right? Which is the story of when you get the Song of Orpheus, who does all these stories of loves that go wrong. And one of those, the story of Mira, it directly picks up on the story of Byblis in book 9. So that connection is totally there.
Yeah.
In between those two stories, particularly with Iphis being like the only happy one in the Met, and that's what every article will say. It's the only happy one. Yeah. It's the only one that's explicitly happy, at least.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the only explicitly happy love stories in all of classical mythology.
Yeah.
Like I put out a call. Like, I just tweeted out, like, it was around Valentine's Day, and I was like, can anyone think of a love story in Greek mythology that does have a happy ending? And a lot of people reference that, Iphis and Ianthe, and I was like, Roman, I don't got it. Like, so, I mean, they're really, like, happiness is relative.
Yeah, I think there is something weird going on with Byblis fails at love and Iphis succeeds at love because they're different love objects and how they go about them. The whole purpose of the Byblis story revolves around how communication is key and how doing communication right is key, because Byblis first writes a letter to her brother. Yeah. And that obviously doesn't go too well, because if you get a letter that says, dear brother, I'd like to do the nasty with you, you're kind of not really feeling up to it. But afterwards, she has this huge speech where she goes, I clearly spoke to him wrong. Like, my communication was bad. Maybe if I'd chosen a different day, or if I'd spoken to him face to face rather than sending a letter. And so that story all revolves around, incest is bad, but particularly communication is important.
Right. If you could have communicated your incest request a little bit better, things might have gone differently. But
then Iphis doesn't communicate. Like, we never hear Ianthe speak. We only get Iphis' side of the story. And there is this in many ways, it's kind of the other way round. It's not a story of incest. It's a story of gender confusion. It's not a story in which communication happens but fails. It's a story in which communication doesn't happen and it succeeds. It's not a story in which a woman... Well, it is also... The Biblis story is also this. It's a story in which a potentially quote-unquote woman tries to exercise masculine desire in a different way. Biblis tries to exercise masculine desire by being a woman, by chasing her brother. Iphis tries to exercise masculine desire by being a man and successfully wins his lover. So there is this kind of paralleling of those two stories that Ovid sets up in the way he connects them on that little hinge of weird shit be happening in Crete.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I mean, in a place where the woman had sex with a bull, I mean,
And that's what Iphis says, right?
Yeah.
This is the land where a woman had sex with a bull. And I can't have sex with that.
She could find love. Why can't I?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, and that's why I do, just to like pull it back to that, because I think we've talked a lot about it as a trans reading, which I think is equally important. But I do also still like the idea of it being a reading of two women who loved each other, but were not in a world where they were permitted to be together, and this was their way of being together. Because like that I just remember that moment, that like kind of, I mean, you have to really suspend disbelief of like, okay, yeah, Pacify, like she was able to love her bull, and like, why can't I? And so I think it's kind of it obviously, like, again, like we were talking about with other things, like nothing about any of this should be read as like an ideal story of queerness in the ancient world, because it's not the way this works. But what it is evidence for these like the acknowledgement of something beyond the standard binary, and people who lived outside of it in the ways in which they might have conceptualized that ability.
Have you ever read Annie Smith's Girl Meets Boy?
No.
Right, it's about 100 pages long, and it's the only reception of the Iphis and the Anthem
Oh
story
yes,
I know.
I've been told about this. Yeah.
And the thing I love most about that, I really enjoyed it as a book. The thing I love most about it is that it does not settle on the genders of those protagonists at all. So what we nominally have is a lesbian couple who meet at an odd time in one of their life, and then they get together and they go and meet co-warriors together, which is great. But the second person in the lesbian couple, the one who I guess is Iphis in this story, or maybe even like Anthem in the story, it's not clear, is called Robin Goodfellow. So there's a lot of masculinization in that name. And then they go round, and it's been some years since I've read this, but they go round when they're doing their eco-terrorism, writing little notes that say, we are the messenger girls, we are the messenger boys, and they alternate between being the messenger girls and the messenger boys. So even in that retelling, just 2006, I think, there's a deliberate, like, I'm not going to settle on what their genders are, because it doesn't actually matter. It's a story of queer love and of queer reading. It doesn't matter where they fit on that spectrum.
Yeah. Huh. Oh, that's really interesting. Also, I love that it kind of links back. Like, I'm going to link it back to the 2006 of it all and be like, oh, that's nice. There was like a good also form of
actual bisexuality as well.
Yeah, exactly. Here we go. The reasonable and well accepted version of bisexuality, and then the absolutely bizarre, nonsensical way of using the word.
Absolutely.
It does remind me of bi-weekly, how it's like, which one? Is it every 2 weeks? Twice a week?
As someone who can't count and can't do time, that is like the bane of my existence. Both of those exist.
Same. As somebody who releases their episodes twice a week and hates math and has ADHD and just generally is like, I don't know. I don't even remember. I know that at some point I had to set it up in Apple, and I think they put in brackets like,
this
is what we mean. And I was like, great.
So helpful.
I don't remember if it's bi-weekly or semi-weekly, but here we are.
We'll take it. Whatever it is, we're running with it.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, this has been so much fun. I love that we talked about so many more characters, just so much of the No, I like truly know. I'm saying this with all honesty. Like, one of the things that I love about talking to people is when we go on these tangents, because like I can talk about almost any mythological character, and I love to. So like if we can connect to more, I mean, especially in the Met, because like I'm slowly having more and more conversations about it.
Mhm.
Thankfully, people keep being like, "Hey, I studied it. You want to talk?" And I was like, "I do."
Yes.
But yeah, like it's such a fascinating text that I've read in so many different forms over
Mhm.
so many years. But having these insights from people who study it and know the Latin and everything, it's such a joy. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to talk about it.
I'm thrilled we finally made this work. This was
Yes.
like a year in the making. I was
Year in the
literally like,
making.
I'm pretty sure at least I was explicit. Often I'm just like have to ghost people by accident because I have a bad brain. But at the very least, I think this time I was like, no, we're gonna come back for next year's Pride. It's
happen.
gonna be great.
Pride Month is not cancelled.
No, I like hell bent on always having Pride content in June, despite having kind of exhausted the myths.
What's out there? Yeah.
There's
fair.
minimal, and most of it involves somebody dying a tragic death.
Yeah.
Here we are, but not Iphis and Ianthe.
Not Iphis and Ianthe.
So
That one's lovely.
what a joy. Is there anything you want to share with my listeners about reading more from you or following anything? You don't have to, but here's your opportunity.
I'm on Twitter if you want to follow me. I sometimes tweet about mythology and Latin stuff. Mostly tweet about like modern Greek poetry and geisha, but that's okay too.
I mean, I think my listeners would equally like that. So
Yeah.
Here we are.
So I'm at Joe Watstein, JoeWatstein, like Frankenstein on the end. And if you really want to read any of my scholarship, it's less dry than me in person. It's more dry than me in person. But if you
I was going to
Google my
say,
name,
you're
you'll
very
find
not
it.
dry in person.
You'll be able to find it if you Google my name if you want to.
Wonderful. Well, I'll link to your Twitter and everything in the episode's description.
Oh, but quick note: do
Yeah.
make sure if you do that it's Joe L. Watson, because otherwise the kind of like alt-righty Paul Joseph Watson, who I share half my names with, unfortunately comes up. So like,
Yeah.
put Joe L. Watson or Watson Classics, because otherwise you'll get some content that is not fun and is not Joe Watson approved.
I appreciate that warning.
Yeah.
I didn't make the connection because it's just the Joe, and
Yeah.
that's I bet you live with that in a very
Every
awful
day.
way a lot of the time. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, on that light note, thank you so much again for doing this. This was
Thank
really,
you.
really fun. Nerds, thank you as always for listening. That episode was long in the greatest way, so I will keep this outro short and sweet. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby was written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Smith is the Hermes to my Olympians, my assistant producer. Laura Smith is the audio engineer and production assistant. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcasts network. Listen on Spotify or Apple or wherever you get your podcasts. And actually check out the Spotify playlist featuring all of the episodes I have done over, I imagine, 7 full years of trying to feature queer and just generally queer stories from the ancient world. There's a Spotify playlist linked in the episode's description for everything I've ever done if you want to hear it all. Thank you all so much as always. What a joy. I love conversation episodes. I am Liv and I love this shit.